Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Barksdale, and I'm a Senior Vice President with Bank of America. I also serve as a member of the Women's Leadership Series Steering Committee. Bank of America is committed to gender equality and has been recognized as a global leader in supporting the development and success of women in the workplace. At Bank of America, 50% of our workforce, 32% of our global management team, 40% of our managers, and 35% of our board of directors are women. My Bank of America colleagues and I are guided by a common purpose to help make financial lives better through the power of every connection. We deliver on this purpose through our commitment to responsible growth, which includes our focus on environmental, social, and governance leadership, or ESG. Our commitment to ESG has helped us respond to the rapid disruption caused first by the coronavirus and then by the very real consequences of systemic racism. Here is a brief video detailing our $1 billion four-year commitment to address racial equality and economic opportunity.
The racial and economic disparities in this country have only been widened by the coronavirus and amplified by the most recent acts of injustice. That's why Bank of America has committed $1 billion over 4 years to address critical gaps in affordable housing, access to healthcare, employment and job skills, and the resources small businesses need to succeed. We can do more to further advance racial equality and economic opportunity for all.
In addition to addressing racial equity and economic opportunity, addressing climate change is equally important to us. Building on our long-standing support for the Paris Climate Agreement, 2 weeks ago, we announced initial steps to achieve our goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions in our financing activities, operations, and supply chain before 2050. Initial steps include active engagement with our clients to help accelerate their own transition to net zero, plans to establish interim science-based emissions targets for high-emitting portfolios, and operational and supply chain goals that build on our achievement of carbon neutrality in our own operations in 2019. It is Bank of America's distinct honor to be the title sponsor of Asia Society's flagship Women's Leadership Series. Asia Society has been at the forefront of raising awareness for women and celebrating their accomplishments. The Women's Leadership Series inspires, educates, and empowers, and is a celebration of diverse women who are making a significant impact both locally and globally. Before I introduce the Women's Leadership Series program for this afternoon and our distinguished speakers, we would like to express our utmost gratitude to the title sponsor of the series, Bank of America, and the presenting sponsors, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Ann and Albert Chow, and Nancy Polichini. We also want to thank the many generous lead sponsors, additional supporters, and special friends, advancing the mission of the series through their support and sponsorship. Special thanks to the Women's Leadership Series Chair, Ann Chow, and the steering committee members who serve as the guide and inspiration for the series. This afternoon's discussion is one of the most important and pressing challenges of our time, climate change. Global energy companies and utility-scale electricity providers play a critical role in the energy transition through their investments in technologies and projects involving carbon capture, methane emissions reduction, and grid flexibility. Some women are at the forefront of these climate change responses, and they are stepping up to confront the challenges through the development of clean energy supplies and other decarbonization solutions as possible sustainable initiatives to address climate change. Last week's extreme weather conditions, along with widespread power outages experienced by Houstonians and residents all over Texas, make this conversation even more pertinent. To discuss some of these topics, we are extremely honored to welcome Dr. Pratima Rangarijni, CEO of Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Climate Investments, a fund set up to reduce carbon emissions in the energy, industrial, and transportation sectors. Before joining OGCI Climate Investments, Pratima was the general manager for GE's onshore wind product line and GE's energy storage startup. She had previously held the role of Deputy Chief Technology Officer and Senior Vice President, Emerging Technology and Research at Vestas Wind Systems. Lori Byrd is Director of World Resource Institute's U.S. Energy Program and the Polsky Chair for Renewable Energy. In this role, she focuses on decarbonization by the utility sector and large buyers, increasing grid flexibility through market design, and transportation electrification. Lori is the co-author of over 150 publications on renewable energy published in academic and trade journals. She is the recipient of several awards for her sustained contributions in renewable energy markets. Moderating the program today is Amy Harder. She is one of the top national energy and climate change reporters in the country. Amy joined Breakthrough Energy, an organization founded by Bill Gates, in early 2021 to launch a new journalism initiative covering the opportunities and challenges of the energy transition. She also writes on these topics in her regular Harder Line column for Axios as an outside contributor. We hope you enjoy the program, and thanks for joining us today.
Great. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for that great introduction. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm joining you from Seattle, Washington, and I hope wherever you are safe and warm and healthy. These are things that have taken on a renewed sense of urgency over the last year. As Lisa said, this conversation couldn't be timelier. We have a new administration that is prioritizing climate change, a pandemic that has shaken the world. And of course, for the Texans among us, the importance of electricity and running hot water could not be more renewed in this time. So I really look forward to having this conversation with Pratima and Laura. I've had the pleasure of meeting Pratima many times, and Lori, I think we've met sort of in the same circles over the years. So it's great to see you again virtually. So I want to open with the crisis in Texas because it is so timely. So I guess my opening question for each of you is what lessons should we take from this energy crisis in Texas when it comes to climate change and our energy infrastructure? Lori, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I think we should take lessons with regard to how we need to prepare for these extreme events going forward. We're seeing more and more of them, wildfires, hurricanes, these extreme cold conditions, right? We need to be prepared for more of these events. Climate change is driving the intensity of these storms, the hurricanes and things like that, right? And we need to prepare in ways that we haven't in the past. So going forward, I think we need to take a look at the kinds of things that we need to do to bolster the grid. And I do think one key element of that going forward is really to reinforce the grid and spend more on grid investments. We've been underspending tremendously on transmission in recent years, and that's another way to really strengthen the grid and be able to pull power from other regions when we have these events to be able to withstand them.
Great, thanks so much. Pratima?
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for having me on this program. I'm going to carry you, take up maybe where Lori left off, which is, there are some fundamental learnings we've got from this Texas issues in Texas this week, in the last couple of weeks, but also COVID, which is that we are all connected, and it's going to translate into the overall climate debate, is that the world is really flat now. We are all connected to each other. And the more we can collaborate and deal with these situations, the faster we can react, because these climate incidences are coming hard and fast. I mean, this last week, we had snow on the Acropolis in Greece. A few weeks ago in Spain, since I'm in Europe, my colleagues were doing cross-country skiing on the streets of Madrid. So they're coming hard and fast. The shovels, by the way, in Madrid came from China. Only the Chinese stores had the shovels within 2 days. So we are a global world, and we really need to collaborate. I think, Lori, you mentioned one of the issues with the grid in the ERCOT and Texas territory. It's quite isolated. And I think neither climate nor weather actually respects national or state boundaries.
So looking at COVID as well, Lori, could you kind of build off that? And do you see lessons from the pandemic about how we can prioritize climate change, even when there does seem to be a more pressing crisis, which is the pandemic?
Yeah, multiple crises, right? We're dealing with all at once. I think the other thing that that COVID raises is the inequity issue, right? Who's bearing the brunt of the impacts of COVID? It's a lot of lower income or disadvantaged communities, and it's a jobs issue, right? And I do think climate change investments are a huge opportunity for driving new jobs, creating clean energy technologies and deploying those, right? We need to do that in a way that benefits these communities and creates jobs. And I think there's a lot of real interest in this, and the Biden administration is certainly very focused on it, right? They've pledged to spend 40% of the climate change investment dollars that are spent in disadvantaged communities. And I think that's a great start. And there's really a lot of interest in doing this. We're also working with a lot of cities who are extremely interested in making sure that those communities benefit from clean energy, that they're able to adopt solar energy, and that they reap those benefits, because they had for years really been borne the brunt of impacts from of the air pollution and impacts from natural gas and other technologies, right? So I think that's really key. We need to keep that in mind as we're trying to address climate solutions. Like, how can we drive this transition in an equitable way that is sustainable and really benefits the broader society?
Great. I want to remind the audience that you can please submit questions via YouTube, and we'll be getting to those toward the end of the program. So please be having a dialogue there, and I'll incorporate them. Pratima, you've said to me a few times when we've met that when you decided to start working on climate change, you actually left renewable energy companies and joined the oil and gas industry. What do you mean by that? Some might be skeptical of that. There's probably some.
You still talk to me after that, Amy.
I talk to everybody.
So, it's funny. I started this journey on climate. I was working for the wind business at that time, and I was going to give a talk in Houston at the Skeptic Society. And they wanted me to talk about wind energy. And I happened to listen to a video talk by Professor Al Bartlett at, I think, Colorado. He's since passed away, but he's talked about population growth for years, just years, since the 70s. And he said, look, population is growing at 1%. And when population grows at 1%, it doubles every 70 years because it's geometric. And I looked down at my baby crawling around at my feet and realized that in his lifetime, we're going to be 12, 14 billion people. And how does the planet sustain that? And then I looked at the size of renewable energy and how much it had to grow, and how much just even power is, what is a fraction of emissions from just the power sector. And I realized that that wouldn't solve the whole problem. Even if our entire grid and our entire power system turned renewables, we couldn't solve the whole problem, because we still have sectors like cement and concrete. Cement is only 40% of its emissions, really, or 50% come from the energy usage. There's another 50% that's just processed, because our world is made of carbon, and carbon is released from the chemical process. And so I realized two things. One is renewables doesn't solve the whole problem. And anyway, renewable technologies was already there. We knew how to do it. It was just a matter of scaling it around the world. But there were lots of other sectors which are considered hard to abate, where there was nobody working on it. So the oil and gas, the climate investments gave me a chance to work on all these other hard to abate sectors. And that's what I do.
I want to get back to some of those topics in more detail in a few minutes, but Lori, I want to turn to you. What role do you see oil and gas companies playing in the energy transition?
I think it's critical. I mean, we are seeing many of those companies making commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They're making investments in clean energy technologies. And I think it's critical. We do need to make this transition from these conventional fuels to electric vehicles and renewable technologies and so forth. And we need all of these players to make these investments and make those shifts to really make it work. And it's going to be in their interest as well. And I think that if you look at the stock market and the valuations of different companies and things like that, they're sending signals too about what's important and where the future is going. And I do think, folks are paying attention. GM just made that announcement about converting to electric vehicles in a short time frame, which was, I think a shock to many people. So we're seeing, just a lot of movement. And I think it's critical that we have that these companies move along as well.
How do you handle, Lori, the controversy that exists in the environmental space about oil and gas companies? I mean, clearly there's some that think that they should not be part of the solution.
I think it's probably naive to think that they're not going to be at any part of the solution, right? Because they are making some investments in these technologies and making shifts and so forth. And so I think it's important to try to move them along as well. And I mean, and then they are making some of these decisions. But there's a lot of challenge, I think, as well, in that backlash. I think what we saw in Texas, for instance, this wasn't necessarily oil and gas, but there was a lot of criticism of wind energy, right? And it's because of this this push to convert to fossil fuels, right? And so wind was picked on as the problem in that situation when it really was a small contributor. I mean, there was issues as well, but it was the natural gas plants and coal plants as well that had significant issues with operating, right? And so that's a real challenge, is addressing those kinds of issues and the backlash that in the political sphere.
Well, I thought it was progress in a weird way, that the criticism from some in the conservative and industry side was that it was wind energy's fault, as opposed to really cold weather proving that climate change is not real. I think we've finally moved past that, which is a pretty significant development and a welcome one, I think, because of course that's how things works. Pratima, I want to come to you about sort of the changing landscape over the last 4 years. I joined Axios in 2017, and then suddenly I found myself talking to oil and gas companies about climate change all the time. It was this weird trend that sort of coincided with President Trump's time in office. How would you say, from your vantage point, has the corporate and economic landscape on the climate technology front in particular changed in the last 4 years?
Quite a bit, but I'll make it a little broader than technology, because I'm not sure technology solves our problem, right? And I'll keep saying this. And I'll also address why we can't leave anyone behind. It's because we create this problem. You can blame different sectors, whether you want to blame wind, oil and gas, it's really irrelevant. It's the food we eat, it's the houses, the steel, cement in the houses, it's the transport, every day that you get into a transport. It's our consumption emissions are a side effect of our consumption. If you have 10 pairs of boots, you got to ask yourself, do you need 10 pairs of boots? Because each of those pairs of boots has a carbon footprint. So I just, I throw this out to everybody, right? It's great for us to blame wind or blame oil and gas or blame coal, but we are on this planet together. Until we stop the blame game and really got cracking, we're not going to crack this. If we expect to grow at 3+% a year, which is what we've done since the mid-20th century, that means we expect our global GDP to double every 20 years. That means we consume a lot more. And that consumption is what creates this issue, right, Amy? So I don't know that technology can solve it by itself. I do think there's a behavioral issue we have to deal with here.
Lori, do you agree with that, that perspective about consumption?
Oh, certainly, yeah. It's really true that individual consumption, people need to take a look at that. Do you need all of the things that we have? I think the energy consumption too is an issue, right? Could we be much more efficient than we are? Yes, right. And establishing building codes to ensure that happens. Do we need houses that are so large? All of that is a large factor, across the board. but also on the energy consumption side. So it's critical to address it.
Pratima, where have you seen the most I guess a twofold question in your work in investments? Where are you seeing the most success, and where are you seeing the biggest challenges?
I think the power sector is the most successful, right? Ever since we found and we invested in solar and wind, that sector has really been decarbonizing. And the UK is a great example. I think in the UK, we're doing lots of coal-free days. Coal is almost out of the mix. And that started with a carbon price that was quite minimal, actually, that they put in place in the UK. And renewables is a much larger part of offshore wind is a much larger part of the power grid here. I think UK is already at close to 1990 levels, right? It's like 60% reduction. I can't remember the exact numbers, but great story. I think we just need to continue to put, and in the power sector on renewables, I will note that those investments aren't as accretive as they used to be. And we have to be really careful about saying, oh, renewables are so cheap that we don't need to help them along, because then it doesn't increase scale as fast as we need to. So I think we continue to double down on that. But the other sectors are still struggling. And here's where I talk about, supply chains. You mentioned that earlier, I think we've really got to do two things. We need better policies in place. So we're looking forward to what the Biden administration will do in terms of creating uptake. So the technologies exist. We have a great cement technology that reduces the carbon footprint by 70%, uses water utilization by 80%. Who's asking for, right? Who do you see who says, look, I absolutely will not buy regular cement, right? Are the architects asking for it? So we'd love to see some policies that create demand. Sorry, Amy?
It's just too expensive. That's the problem, right?
No, it's the same cost basis. This is one of the amazing things is it will take only a few plants for it to come to almost the same cost basis. And so it doesn't require a huge carbon footprint, but it is difficult to switch, right? So if you look at the carbon pricing we're going to get in Canada, for example, this thing will be in the money, no problem. But it does take institutional change because, cement and concrete companies have to do things differently. So what is their incentive? What's pushing them? So carbon pricing would be excellent, some levels of policy, but I also think private supply chains. And this is what I talk to my big companies as well. Put it in your supply chains and create the demand, and then we can accelerate, because I think innovators will come out of the woodwork to do it. We just need to create demand.
Lori, I want to ask you a question about the government's role. How big and for how long should the government have a role in incentivizing new technologies? And what would you say is the best example to emulate?
Well, I think on incentives, ideally, you don't want to over incentivize technologies because it becomes very expensive, right? So, and it's really difficult to get this right. I think we've seen challenges with this in the past, right? And Germany's whole experience with feed-in tariffs and just the history. But I think to Pratima's point that we do need to encourage and rapid scaling of these technologies and acceleration of them, right? And so it's really important to make sure that we don't disrupt the markets and pull the plug on investments or incentives before they really have served their useful life, right? So it is, I think it's a continuing discussion about, how long we need to incentivize these, but I think one of the key roles that government really needs to play is to establish these targets and set ground rules so that, utilities in the power sector really have guide rails of like where they need to go and can they get things through the commission because they have requirements to meet certain targets by certain dates. I think it's critical that we need to get to that point very, very soon of just requiring certain amounts of emissions reductions or amount of clean energy portfolios. I think that's almost the most critical piece of this because we can do it much faster with that kind of certainty. And that's what a critical role, I think, on the government side.
And Amy, I think Lori's, I totally support the way Lori phrased it, which is they need to set targets because they need to stay away from telling us what technology. And if they set targets, let the innovators, let industry get to those targets in the most cost-effective manner. And I think we would see a lot of progress very quickly. But I've never seen technologies really scale fast enough with no policy intervention. It's very difficult.
So Pratima, over the last 4 years, there's been a big shift, as I mentioned earlier, among oil and gas companies, particularly the international ones. Some American companies have joined OGCI, which I understand is sort of the umbrella organization which you are part of. Can you talk about why there's been this shift in the oil industry to be more embracing of climate change, and how should state-owned oil companies be considered in this debate?
It's interesting that I get asked this question, and within my 12 companies in the OGCI, we don't really see a big difference between state-owned and private enterprise, except where the signals come from, right? And the European companies went first because the signals were very strong in Europe on climate change and what the shareholders wanted. The American companies, I think, the states put a lot of pressure on them, but the federal government recently, in the past administration, I think was sending mixed signals. So I think they're all there. I think what the issue is, they're all there if I look at European and American companies, right? The large ones, not the small, I can't speak to others that I don't know. Some regions are not there. But I'm going to go on a limb and say that it's voluntary still, one, and that it is inconsistent. And it's inconsistent and voluntary because the governments in our state have not played their part in putting policies out there telling us where we want society to go. That is not private industry responds to shareholders. And so they're responding to the shareholders. That's what you're seeing. But shareholders are inconsistent. The financial shareholders are also inconsistent. I have in the same meeting where someone says, it's great you reduced your methane. And another shareholder says, and how many pennies did I lose this quarter because of that? So I just worry that without the right incentives, and policy is a great leveler of the playing field. You put a carbon price on something or a carbon tax or whatever it is you decide to do, or regulatory structure, everyone's going to comply. We'll move there really fast. I think they're all ready to move, and many of them are going to move. I don't see everyone wants to move. I think their different strategies is a lot about culture within the companies and what they think is feasible. Because change is hard. Change is hard for big companies, just as it is for us individuals.
I want to bring in a question from the audience now, actually, because I think it's timely about the Paris Climate Agreement. So, of course, the Biden administration has rejoined the agreement, which, as the viewer writes, most agree is a good step. But most countries are failing to meet their targets. Do you think the agreement is ineffective?
Do you want me to take that?
Sure.
First,
I can also comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical to have this kind of international discussion and target setting and collaboration to address these issues, right? And get all countries on board to move, to set targets and move towards them. I do think, there's challenges in meeting these targets, right? But even if progress is made, that's really useful, right? Which is not to say that I think, it's critical that we set targets and we do meet them. But I think it's a really critical step to have these discussions and these targets established. So, but it's the hard work is to establish the policies at the federal level, right, to make sure that you can meet those, and we need that as well, right? So we need these international targets, but then we also need the backup, right? Of do we need a clean energy standard, or do we need significant progress on electrification? So we need it at all levels. So it's really important.
So let me turn to the Biden administration. What are sort of the top 2 or 3 policies that you from your organizations think that you want the Biden administration to do and that you think the Biden administration could do? Of course, those are 2 different things. So Pratima, maybe I'll start with you. Are there specific policies that you think would be beneficial to these investments that the Biden administration could pursue?
So I'll stay away from the specific policies because then I'd have to be fair across the world, since my companies are around the world. But I would say that methane emissions need to be curtailed immediately, because methane is extremely potent, but it has a shorter lifespan, so it gives us a big hit immediately. So we cannot. That is a travesty. They've got to deal with that. So that's one. The second, which is one of my favorite topics, is efficiency. Look, we're wasting resources, you waste money, and then you have emissions on top of it. Let's get efficiency targets across the board, whether it's vehicular, buildings. It's something we can all participate in when we put our mind to it. And third, of course, is we need the dialysis. It's carbon capture and storage. We're not done it fast enough, so now it's time for us to start doing some of the more, and those are especially needed to deal with some of the harder to decarbonize sectors. So those are the 3 areas I think, Amy.
Pratima, I remember one analogy you gave me on the sidelines of, I think, the last Sarah Week that was in person, something about how imagine if you throw out, like if you have 3 bags of groceries and you throw one out the window, like that's how much energy we're wasting in the energy system. Did I remember that correctly?
It's the other way, unfortunately.
Oh, you throw out 2 bags.
Yeah. The way we do, most of our systems, if you look across the systems, are extremely inefficient. Food systems are actually one of the most efficient. We only lose half of what we produce. So 2 bananas, you got to build 2 bananas for each banana you want, right? But if you look across the energy systems, and it's much worse. It's between 2/3 and 3/4, depending on where you look in the world, right? So just imagine if most systems on average, 2/3 inefficient. You only use 1 banana out of the 3 that you make, but you use the resources for 3, you emit for 3, and you actually eat only 1. So the best thing actually is don't ask for any bananas. Then you save 3 emissions factors, or get efficient. So it's only a 2-to-1 or, 1.5-to-1. Efficiency is critical. All the models to less than 2 degrees assume a huge amount of efficiency increases, and we've actually been sliding back. Lori, you probably see it a lot in the sectors you look at, transport and electricity.
Yeah.
Well, COVID isn't helping the efficiency front as we're all trying to heat the outdoors to socialize outside the weather. But Lori, let me turn that question on policy to you. What are sort of the top 3? And if you want to sort of continue the efficiency conversation, we can do that as well. But on the policy front with the Biden administration, what are the top couple of things that you're really pushing for that you think could actually pass?
Well, I think this infrastructure bill that's being discussed is a huge opportunity, right, to address a variety of things. We need research and development on a variety of technologies. They did just pass some of that, but deploying infrastructure throughout the U.S., that we do need to get investments to the cities and states, that have been so hard hit by COVID, right, and have been taking a lead on driving a lot of this change and have made aggressive targets to reduce emissions and to drive clean energy. And support for them, I think, is a critical piece of all of this, and so that they can actually deploy a lot of this on the ground. In addition, I think it would be ideal if, as going back to my comment earlier about setting targets, if we could get a clean electricity standard through Congress, that would be ideal, I think, in terms of providing that certainty to the utilities to be able to take action to move the power sector more rapidly to utilizing clean energy sources. I think that's really critical. We need that really, really soon, because it's a challenge with, utilities are retiring coal plants, but then the question is, is the investment in natural gas or is it in renewables? And there's a lot of questions there about, how much gas can we retain on the system? What are the guide rails here for them? That we're going to have to, if we build new gas, we're going to have to, switch it to running on hydrogen or shortening the lifetime of those plants, right? So there's a lot of investment decisions that are being made right now, and we just need that certainty in the future for folks to really make good decisions and get them through commissions and things like that. So I think that's another piece. And then just the electrification of transport, I think there's huge opportunities there, right? There's already been some actions in the executive order to try to get the government to be electrifying fleets and various things. And there was just another one about rare earth minerals and materials for batteries and so forth that the Biden administration did yesterday. And, that's really important too, that I think there's a lot of opportunity for the government to be accelerating those markets as well. So it's another critical piece. There's a lot of pieces that are really important though, which is, I do think the administration is taking a pretty broad and comprehensive view and trying to integrate this throughout different agencies, which is excellent. We have not seen this kind of coordination really in the past. So we're off to a good start, I think.
So climate change is, of course, the ultimate global challenge, and emissions are rising the fastest in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, but really across the continent. What can the U.S. do? I guess, Lori, the question would be regarding the U.S. and Pratima, how are you thinking about this region of the world in your investments? What can be done to help ensure that Asia can reduce its emissions, or at least not continue to aggressively grow its emissions, while also, of course, importantly, ensuring that its people can grow into a standard of living just like Americans and people in Europe? So I guess, Lori, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, there's so many ways that we can help. The WRI actually does a lot of work with companies to accelerate the adoption of clean energy technologies. So trying to get companies there to take action to convert their own electricity demand to clean energy sources. That's a critical piece, and that we can play a role there. I think to the extent that we're trying to solve some of the new technology issues, if we can make it investments there and try to bring new technologies along. Just look at what's happened with vehicle electrification and advancements there, right? And can we, and China's also really leading in this, but can we just accelerate those markets together and drive those technologies forward? There's still a need, I think, for a lot of investments in hydrogen and long duration storage and things like that, right? So that can be helpful too, to the extent that we can be playing a role in trying to drive more of those technologies to market. I'll stop there.
Pratima?
I think there's one answer that's clear, Amy. We need to get rid of coal. I just, the impact of coal on the climate challenge is huge. We have 7 countries in Asia that really do all the coal. And so the question I'd say, and the climate doesn't care about national boundaries. So if you spend another $1 in Norway or Iceland on climate change, you could get a hell of a lot more if you put that $1 in Asia, right? So this concept of investing within countries, and that is one of the challenges of Paris climate, is it's about country targets. So it's great. So I'll take an unnamed country where they have country targets, but they're selling their coal plants all over the rest of the world. So the country targets, I don't think, are working. Right. I went to a country in one of the countries in Europe. They were losing jobs because of climate change, but they were importing coal-based electricity from another country, neighboring country. So we're playing these games that need to stop. And I think the real question is, can at COP26 or otherwise, a group of nations come together, and even if it's just gas and CCS, we're not ready with hydrogen at scale, right? But even if it's gas and CCS, can we replace coal plants and allow Asians to get their energy at a decent rate? In Delhi, I was on a panel with this lady who runs an NGO, and she basically is begging for replacement of coal because of the kids, the asthma, the challenges, health challenges. and LNG is just too expensive. So what can we do to get coal out of the system? And then we'll do the rest. Because we've seen in the numbers for both the US and the UK, just getting coal out of the system got us so much profit in from a carbon perspective.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's true. It's critical, and it's just a lot of growth there.
Thanks for everybody who's been sending in questions. I'm going to get to those in just a couple of minutes, but I want to do what I call a lightning round, which is where I say a word and you say the first word or very short phrase that pops into your head. So, if I said red wine, you might say your favorite red wine, but I'm not going to say that because that's not relevant to our discussion today. So the first word I'm going to say is natural gas. What's the first adjective or noun or phrase that pops into your head when you hear the word natural gas?
From the climate perspective, methane.
Oh, I was going to say the same. No, but I think the other phrase is around these critical decisions right now about, can we deploy more? I just broke all the rules of your lightning round.
That's okay. It's hard to keep people following the rules, particularly format. So deploy more of what exactly?
Oh, it's just these questions about new natural gas deployment. Well, can we deploy it or not?
Oh, exactly. Okay, so that's okay. Great. Well, that was you guys mostly complied with my rules there. So the next question is nuclear power.
Save.
Sorry, what'd you say about Lori?
Save it. Save.
Okay. Love it, but don't really trust those humans.
And the next one is the last one is Green New Deal.
Politicized.
Make it pragmatic.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I want to do a final lightning round where I ask each of you to say, what is one super innovative technology that you think isn't getting very much attention at all, but that you think needs more time, attention, and money?
Well, can I answer that in a slightly different way? I mean, just in terms of technologies, I'm just so excited about vehicle electrification right now, and just the progress that has been made in recent years, and the cost reductions there, and the ability, the range improvements, and the ability to deploy that at scale. I'm just really excited about all of those technological advances and the opportunity there.
I'll be really boring. I'll go with my efficiency and waste heat recovery. We've really got to get more efficient, because if we keep going out and mining more resources, don't recycle them, we're not going to, we might stop our emissions, but we will pillage the earth. So I'll go with anything to do with efficiency, but waste heat recovery is tough. Like to see more.
Great. I'm going to move on to the questions now, and we have several here. One question viewer here asks about what type of research, additional research, do you think is needed in order to provide lasting solutions to climate change? And we talk a lot about how these technologies just need to scale, but are there areas that really do need more research?
Long-term storage.
Yeah.
Long duration storage, sorry.
Yeah, we just did some paper on that and agree. Yeah, it's just not a clear winner there or solution, right? I mean, there's hydrogen long term, but there's a lot of different options, and there's not a lot of clear winners and barriers to many of the solutions there. Kidding.
So you both agree on that one. Well,
yeah, I was going to say the same.
I'm just trying to get you guys to disagree, because that's
all right.
I'm just kidding. A question about Elon Musk and maybe also Jeff Bezos, actually. What do you think about his idea of populating other planets like Mars, given apparently it can sustain human life? Do you think Earth is beyond saving?
No, definitely not. We got to save Earth, and we can. We just, sometimes it just takes people a while to really realize the urgency of it. And I think people are starting to get there. It just takes a while. And then once we decide we need to do it, we can do it, and things move quickly when they need to, I think, and when the costs change or we really address it. So I'm a stone earth person myself.
I refuse to disagree with Lori. So absolutely. But you know what? On the one hand, I'm a big fan of his innovative talent. I mean, he's absolutely, all the things I thought wasn't possible, he's made possible. So I'd love to have, maybe Lori and I and you, Amy, should sit down with him and have a discussion on some of these. But on the one hand, I love his 100 million for carbon capture. On the other hand, the cryptocurrency uses as much power, energy as Argentina, and it barely runs any part of our financial system. So I really think that if he applied himself to thinking about climate change, we would have a fabulous advocate, considering what all on Earth, with Lori on Earth, that we would have a fabulous advocate. And I think he would do things that we wouldn't think possible today. So I'm all for voting him in the club of Earth.
On planet.
More trees here that are just beautiful, right?
I think if everybody had 5 minutes on Mars, they would probably want to stick with Earth.
Yeah,
but I do suggest we send our teenagers for a couple of years.
I'm not going to tell mine that. Get in trouble.
Another question, Earth asks, do you both think that requiring an indication of carbon cost on products could help lessen the carbon produced from consumption over time? So it's sort of a question about disclosure. I saw a story today in Axios, my former employer, about how Cheniere is going to put sort of a carbon disclosure on its LNG that it sends out.
I think, Amy, if you believe that putting calories on food has impacted our consumption, then perhaps we do believe that this, right? And I'm not sure it does, because we get immune to it in a very short time, right? Prices go up, you're shocked, and then after a while you get used to it. It's similar for carbon. I really think those are small and incremental changes, and this requires a systemic change. We've backed ourselves into the wall in terms of time that we have to scale things. And so those are voluntary measures. They're good measures. You don't stop them, but they're not going to scale us fast enough.
I think it can be important for certain types of appliances and things where consumers don't necessarily know, right? Certain types of TVs can use tremendous amounts of energy. And if you're not really attuned to all that, having the Energy Star label or labeling that talks about the energy consumption of these devices is, I think, really helpful. And that might be the area where it's most critical. But, there's also the transport of goods and the carbon emissions of moving them around that people also don't necessarily know. I do think ways of increasing awareness on the part of customers is helpful. It is a challenge to figure out a way to do that clearly and in a verified manner, so it's tricky, but maybe really focusing on the most energy consuming pieces of it is a good.
Amsterdam, I think it's the donut economy. I think Amsterdam, there's a book on that, and there are a couple of cities actually doing it right now. And so I think it'll be interesting to watch the progress there. And there a lot of cities from around the world are calling them. I think it is Amsterdam. I think it's the donut economy. They're following the policies in that book.
Great. Another question on the Great Texas Blackout, as this viewer calls it, showed us that the independent grid was set up and incentives structured with no incentive for winterization. How can we get policymakers up to speed on such policy errors? Maybe Lori,
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. I know that Texas has taken a different approach to enabling prices to rise to deal with some of these kinds of issues. And yeah, I do think there's a real need for market reforms in wholesale power markets going forward for a whole variety of reasons, right? We need to make sure that in the future, as we're making rapid changes to the generation sources on the grid, the way things are operating is changing. And the operating characteristics of wind and solar is very different, right, from other sources. And it's not just that, right? We've got all these different factors and more interaction on the customer side and battery storage playing a role, right? So things are changing very quickly, and the market designs and rules need to evolve rapidly as well. And I think a critical area is making sure that we have enough capacity to withstand, to make sure we meet peak demand and also withstand these extreme events going forward. And how do we determine that? Because the extreme events are changing, but also the types of generation that and the characteristics of it. I think we need to incorporate more of that into those decision-making processes going forward. And what I mean by that is like wind energy, sometimes, when that's operating, you can need other sources that can ramp up and down very quickly to coincide with that, right? And so we not only need enough generating capacity as backup, but we need characteristics of it to make sure that we have it there. And the systems aren't really fully set up to do all these things, and the needs are changing very rapidly.
Great. Next question about hydrogen that I think I'll send to you first, Pratima. How much impact do you believe that green electrolysis / hydrogen will have in mitigating and eliminating carbon emissions from heavy industries like chemicals and cement?
Which decade, Amy? Right.
I think it's 2030s, 2040s, the next 3 decades.
Yeah, I think the hydrogens can very easily be used in industrial situations within the next few decades. I think then to take them further into consumer use, et cetera, in transport, I think it just takes a little longer from an infrastructure perspective. The technologies that we know how to use hydrogen, chemical plants, we've lived with it for a long time, we know how to do it safely. It really is now about infrastructure build, and so I think for industrial use, it's really possible because the safety measures are in place and we know how to do it.
Great. Question for both of you about the role of public pressure. What role do you think activists play in changing governmental policies and policies of specific companies?
I think COVID has been really interesting, or this past year has been an interesting example of that, and that, the protests and the public reaction to many the events over the year really have had an effect and have just changed the discussion in a variety of ways, right? And so I think it's really important. And the youth are really important to this too. They're going to have to deal with these issues, and they're getting much more interested. I can tell you my son is very active and interested in these issues already, which is great to see. So it's important. We need it, and it helps, right? And I think we need it in areas too where the politics are more mixed. We've seen the situation in Georgia change, right? And but other regions too, when you think about it from a clean energy perspective, some of the regions that are resistant to this really have a lot to gain from clean energy deployment. Like wind and solar are really great for many rural areas, right? So I think it's critical to have that piece of it.
In my final 2 questions, I want to take one from the audience, one last one from the audience, and then one that ties in to this program writ large. So a question from the audience: how do you project the job market will look like in the future for energy and STEM graduates? Maybe Pratima, you want to do that one?
I think it's going to be extremely vibrant. Look, we cannot live without energy. It is, there's a Human Development Index that the UN produces. It's related to energy. Energy access is what drives economies. So I think it's going to be vibrant. The real question we need to answer is, how do we make it vibrant in some Africa and in some Asian countries where we've got to get to that basic level of Human Development Index? We are plateaued in the United States and Northern Europe. We use much more than our fair share. But how do we take what we know and get the graduates to really work in these other countries as well?
Lori, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think energy is kind of exciting now. I think it used to be kind of boring, but it's actually really interesting. It's changing so fast. And I've heard that from some folks who are at utilities, and you see a lot of young people coming into the industry and are really excited because there's a lot of interesting problems to solve.
Great. And so for my concluding question, I want to step one step away from the energy climate discussion and talk about sort of your careers and ask you to reflect on that a little bit, given this is the Women's Leadership event. So you both clearly achieved a lot in the industries that you work in. What advice would you have for anyone getting into the energy and climate sectors, particularly for women and people of color?
Okay. I think women, especially in climate, I find more women more interested. I find them coming to the fore because they can relate it to families and they can relate it to generational things very, very quickly. So I'm not saying it's not for men. I think it's true for everybody. But I think it's an opportunity. Whenever there's change, it's an opportunity for those who aren't in the, for minorities to get in there and create new ways, to create new situations where you can move forward. And I think we should grab it and go for it. And these are problems where pragmatism and innovation and creativity really dominate. And I really think women and minorities have a play here where they might not in established, or what did you say, Lori, boring situations.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think there's, in terms of minorities, and right now is an excellent time to really take the opportunity that we have. There's really a ton of interest and focus on trying to engage these voices, and if you look at the Biden administration, really focused on that and has tried to incorporate that in the staff throughout the administration. So there's a lot of opportunities, I'd say, right now, which is really critical. And you got to seize those. I think that's one thing you learn over your career, right? Is you got to go for it when it's there, right? And I think another thing that's important maybe is to focus on impact, right? Thinking about your skills and where your position and how can you drive the most impact in the situation that you're in and move things forward. I think that's really, and sometimes we get so busy that it's hard to keep sight of that, but it's really important. And the way to be most successful is if you're really focused on that, I think.
And we're hiring for carbon impact.
We are too, actually. We have a lot of positions open as well.
We're hiring investors and technologists, so come join us. And Lori.
And I also think Breakthrough Energy is hiring. So, hopefully that is good news.
There's an opportunity. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, Pratima and Lori, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today. It's great to see you both. And I do hope to see you in person, maybe at the COP. I know we'll be there if it happens in person. And to the viewers, I want to say I hope you really enjoyed it. Join the Asia Society next Thursday, March 4th, for a program with CNN's Fareed Zakaria. At this members-only program, Fareed will reflect on his latest book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Learn more about the upcoming programs and how to become a member through the Asia Society website. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.